So Matt, why do you have a piece of uranium ore in the studio?
Well, because it's cool, it's also a little freaky, and because it was left off of a very important list that made the news.
Today I'm announcing we're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy.
It turns out the Russia-Ukraine war is exposing a problem that doesn't get that much coverage: the nuclear fuel supply chain. And that could have major impacts on the future of nuclear power in the United States. In response to the invasion of Ukraine, the US and other countries have placed sanctions on Russia, including energy resources like oil and gas, but not uranium.
Russia is a huge player on the global stage when it comes to nuclear energy, and particularly when it comes to the uranium supply chain.
Justine Kalma is a science reporter at The Verge who wrote a story about why it's so hard for the US to quit Russian uranium.
The US can pretty easily turn its back on Russian oil and gas and has not been able to pull the trigger on uranium because we rely on Russia for a significant chunk of our uranium.
Uranium is a common nuclear fuel because its isotope, U-235, is easily split during fission, releasing tons of energy. Nuclear power is highly contested, but it still makes up about half of our carbon-free electricity in the US. Right now, the Biden administration is investing heavily in nuclear energy to meet the US's climate goals, which is why we're talking about uranium. So when we talk about nuclear power, it all kind of starts with this: uranium ore, which is radioactive. That's why we're wearing gloves. We did speak to professionals about how to properly handle this stuff, so we're taking all the necessary precautions, but don't try this at home. Most uranium ore is like this sample. It's overwhelmingly not uranium. Low-grade uranium ore only has about 0.1% of uranium in it. The rest of this ore is just regular rock, plus some elements like lead, thorium, and bismuth that the uranium is slowly decaying into. It's actually those daughter products that are tripping our Geiger counter. We need a much more sensitive device to sniff out the uranium. Somewhere in this sample is a very small amount of this, a mineral that's rich in uranium, called uraninite, which is, for lack of a better expression, just a lot of uranium packed in very tightly. This stuff is one of many minerals that has uranium in them. And even that small bit of uranium tucked inside tons of useless rock, most of that is the wrong isotope for uranium fuel.
Naturally occurring uranium, like the stuff that you dig out of the ground, has very low levels of U-235.
The point is, we need a lot of uranium ore to produce a relatively tiny amount of fuel, and it takes a lot of work to make that happen. To be useful as nuclear fuel, uranium has to go through a conversion and enrichment process, which basically means taking a bunch of U-235 and packing it in really tight.
So uranium, it needs to be mined, it needs to be turned into yellow cake, that yellow cake needs to be converted into a gas, that gas needs to be enriched so it has higher concentrations of U-235, and then that enriched uranium needs to be fabricated into a fuel rod. Now, that doesn't all happen in like one smooth go.
This is an extremely laborious process, and it's contracted out to different companies, and only a handful of countries are really up to doing this, like France, Russia, and China.
There are security concerns along that entire supply chain because when you enrich uranium, it can be enriched for nuclear energy, it can also be enriched for nuclear weapons. It's been sort of a saturated market as well, but demand is starting to grow.
Some governments are now reprioritizing nuclear power as an alternative to fossil fuels, so the supply chain is back in the spotlight. Which brings us back to Russia. The Russia-Ukraine war has amplified ongoing tensions between the US and Russia, and it's exposed the vulnerabilities of the nuclear supply chain. One potential answer to that problem? A strategic uranium reserve.
This is basically a stockpile of uranium to fuel our power plants, in case of emergency. Say this war drags on as it has dragged on, maybe we can pull from our strategic uranium reserve.
The war also jeopardizes the build-out of next-generation nuclear reactors. Most plants today run off of a fuel that's enriched to 5% of U-235, but newer reactors in development need to bump that up to as much as 20%.
Having that higher concentration of U-235 makes for a more efficient fuel, basically, and that allows for reactors that can be built to be much smaller than today's ginormous nuclear reactors. And when you shrink the size, you also shrink the costs, and cost has been one of the biggest roadblocks for more nuclear energy.
Right now, the only country that can commercially make this next-gen fuel is, you guessed it, Russia. The US is working on its own production facility to make next-gen fuel, but it's still going to take years to really move the needle on American uranium independence. So if we're going through all this trouble to stockpile and enrich uranium, some argue that the US might as well start mining it again too, which doesn't have the best track record. From the 1940s to the 1980s, mining companies dug up lots of uranium ore in the western US, and decades later, the EPA is still trying to clean up the mess that was left behind. Many indigenous tribes object to the return of mining on or near their lands, which are still littered with toxic waste.
If you turn to the Navajo Nation, hundreds of uranium mines left over on Navajo lands that have been linked to cancer and other horrible health outcomes because of uranium contamination of water and other problems with the legacy of those mines.
Nuclear power's issues don't end at mining. There's the issue of storing radioactive waste and the threat of meltdowns. So there's a lot at stake here. The Biden administration recently set a goal of reaching 100% carbon-free energy by 2035. And Biden wants nuclear power to be part of that puzzle. So the debate around it may only intensify.
There's no question that climate change really is a crisis that the world has to face. And some of the biggest fights now are going to be how are we going to meet that crisis? And nuclear energy is really one of the core questions at the center of that debate. And it's only going to become a bigger flashpoint as we move forward. Here's what advocates for more nuclear energy say. Beggars can't be choosers. We need carbon-free energy, and here's nuclear, right? It's not perfect, but we don't have a whole lot of great options.
That debate won't be resolved anytime soon, so looks like we're going to be stuck with this rock for a little while longer. Can I wash my hands now? You guessed it, Russia. You guessed it, Russia.
You guessed it, Russia. That part?
You guessed it, Russia. You guessed it, Russia. I'll do the Norm Macdonald way. You guessed it, Frank Stallone. You guessed it, Russia. You guessed it, Russia. You guessed it, Russia.
You guessed it, Russia. And then you circle on Russia.
Got it. You guessed it, Russia.